Many fans of the USSR in Russia claim that Soviet Union gave them or their parents free apartments. But it is just the contrary. The collapse of the system in 1991 allowed them to finally privatize and own the flats and houses where they lived for decades without having the right to call them their own. There is one meme that I want to show you today. It is one of my favorite when describing the ideology and the essence of Soviet Union. It says how good that the previous owners were executed, so that people can resettle and start living in a new apartment they could never expect to own. Expropriate and resettle private property, said once Lenin, and it all began. Among many crazy ideas that communism brought to this part of the world, the idea of united free housing was pretty toxic. Somehow they believe that uniting people from different social groups and backgrounds in one physical space is a good idea that will lead to mutual growth and friendship. But it did not turn out that way. In 1918, pretty soon after the start of communism regime, the right of private property was cancelled, and the perverted understanding of living, housing and household traditions in Soviet Union began. The beginning of Soviet Union history was marked with the central idea of industrialization and, of course, combined with urbanization. That's why many people, waves of people, were encouraged to come to big cities. And the number of these cities grew up to 80% more. But these people had to live somewhere, and many of them were not acquainted with central heating, running water, and the rules of living in flats, apartments, and not barracks. So the hunting for free living space began. And one of the decrees of the communists describes that wealthy flats are to be expropriated and resettled. So what is a wealthy flat according to the standards of the beginning of Soviet Union? This is a flat that has more rooms than people living in it, or at least the equal number of people and rooms. There were many such flats in the cities like St. Petersburg, Moscow and other big urban centers, and many of them were resettled. Eviction is one of the most important phenomena of that period. In 1925, groups of communists were looking for free flats or wealthy flats to resettle them with different kinds of people. And it was pretty typical for a 4-room flat to host 20-25 people coming from totally different cultural, social, and professional backgrounds. In 1926, another unusual thing was fixed in Soviet legislation, and that is registration, or also known as propiska. A person who lives in a particular place, even a hotel room longer than 3 days, was supposed to register himself or herself to be found in case of emergency. And you know that all the emergencies in Soviet Union were pretty dangerous for the one who was looked for. But even with evictions and expropriations, there were not enough rooms for people who came to the cities as a result of Soviet Union urbanization. And the norm of space, if it's possible to say so, for a person was less than 9 square meters. If the room gave you more than 9 square meters per person, then it could have been resettled. In 1927, many new communal flats were built. This is the start of a new cultural thing, if it's possible to say cultural, when we talk about communal flats. They still exist, especially in the central districts of many cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, in historical districts, and sometimes are even inhabited by people who got used to this kind of living. Of course, there are historical descriptions of communal flats in 19th century, but they were not so popular. And the Soviet Union gave real birth to this type of housing. So what is a communal flat? Definitely something very dark, very depressive, and I cannot imagine myself living in a place like that. It was a perfect breeding ground for police informants, and you could hear, smell, or even see everything your neighbors did. Many people didn't even own a flat or a room in this communal apartment, but just rented a corner. And the kitchen, the toilet, the corridor was joined. So people coming from, once again, different social background, professions, and having different attitudes to life in general, met each other daily. And it created a weird mixture of family life with people who are totally unknown to you. And in many films about Soviet Union and documentaries, you can see glimpses of life in kommunalka. That's how they were called in Russia. And the kind of joint kitchen where people could have separate tables and conflicts is an illustration that everything had to be open, everything had to be shared in Soviet Union. But it was pretty difficult, especially for those people who belonged to intelligentsia and had different imagination of their life before the revolution. In 1931, more private flats started to be constructed. And very often they were given to people as credits for their service to the motherland. It was like a prize or like a symbol of specific achievements for the communist representatives, party elite, ruling class that still existed in a society that pretended to be extremely equal. And approximately in this time, we have a new architectural style appearing known as the Stalin's architecture, and houses built during this period are known as stalinkas. They still exist and stand in many cities that were once occupied by Soviet Union, including my native city in Ukraine. They are pretty well preserved as they were built to high standards of architecture and by the architects who studied and lived before the revolution. So perhaps they were still acquainted to the norms and demands of a normal housing. And stalinkas were planned for not ordinary Soviet people, but those who are respected or occupy specific positions in that society. But even in these flats, it was pretty normal for a couple of families to live. For example, a 3-room flat could be inhabited by 2 different families of a husband and wife, 2 children, or a husband and wife and 1 child. Once again, sharing the kitchen and the toilet, which is not always comfortable, I guess. Even though stalinkas were popular back in the USSR and they are still popular among people who like this style and buy them for living, there were not many such houses built all over Soviet Union if you compare them with future Soviet styles. What is also important, many people continued living in barracks at that time, and barracks are worse than any communal apartment. Less than a year before the start of Russian war in Ukraine, I have visited Kharkiv, a beautiful Ukrainian city that is very strong, though suffers a lot from Russian missile attacks. In the center of Kharkiv, there is a very tragic building known as Slovo House. It was constructed in 1929 as a collective house for notable Ukrainian writers, literary critics, translators, artists, and actors and sculptors and many other very interesting and bright personalities. They moved in at the beginning of 1930 to celebrate New Year in their new luxury apartments with lots of flats and places for creativity and exchange of thoughts. But very quickly Stalin's terror began, and out of 66 flats in this house, 40 were suffering from Stalin's terror, and their hosts and owners were arrested and then executed. For example, two of my favorite Ukrainian writers of that period, Mike Johansson and Valerian Podmohylny, were caught there, arrested, and later executed. Putin wants to rebuild Soviet Union with its gloomy reality and terror. We have to debunk Soviet myths that fuel his military machine. My name is Anna, I'm a Ukrainian, and I don't want to live in the USSR. Do you?